The sound of children's laughter drifting up through the floorboards at 3 in the morning isn't something you expect to hear when you live alone. But there I was, frozen in my kitchen with a glass of water halfway to my lips, listening to what sounded impossibly like a family having breakfast directly beneath my feet, in a basement that had been sealed off for 20 years. In a house where my husband Marcus had vanished without a trace 2 decades ago, leaving me to raise our daughter alone and wonder every single day what had happened to the man I thought I knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Geraldine Murphy, though everyone has called me Gerry since I was 5 years old, and declared that Geraldine was far too fancy for a girl who preferred catching frogs to playing with dolls. I'm 62 now, with silver-streaked auburn hair that refuses to behave and laugh lines that map out a life of both joy and sorrow. For the past 20 years, I've lived in the same Victorian house in Millbrook, Connecticut, where Marcus and I bought when our daughter Elena was just 3 years old. It's a grand old place with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and enough character quirks to keep you busy with repairs for a lifetime. The house sits on Maple Street, shaded by ancient oak trees that drop their leaves like confetti every autumn. There's a wraparound porch where I drink my morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up, and a garden out back where I grow tomatoes and herbs that Elena says taste better than anything you can buy at the farmer's market. It's the kind of house that should be filled with family gatherings and holiday celebrations, but for 2 decades it's mostly been just me, rattling around in rooms that still echo with memories of the life I thought I was building. Marcus disappeared on a Tuesday in October 2004. I remember because Elena had a school play that Thursday, and she kept asking when Daddy would be home to help her practice her lines. He'd left for work that morning the same way he always did, kissing me goodbye at the kitchen counter while I packed Elena's lunch, promising to pick up milk on the way home. He was a contractor then, running his own small business with his brother Danny, mostly doing kitchen renovations and bathroom remodels for families in our area. Steady work, honest work, the kind that put food on the table and let us sleep well at night. When he didn't come home that evening, I called Danny. When Danny said Marcus never showed up to the job site that day, I called the police. When the police found his truck abandoned in the parking lot of a rest stop 40 miles away with his wallet, keys, and cell phone still inside, I called everyone I could think of. Friends, relatives, old coworkers, even people I barely knew but thought might have seen him or heard something. For months I lived on the phone and on hope, plastering missing person flyers around 3 counties and checking in with Detective Rivera every few days for updates that never came. The official investigation lasted 2 years. They found no evidence of foul play, no financial irregularities, no indication that Marcus had been planning to leave. His bank accounts remained untouched. His business continued to receive calls from potential clients that he never returned. His favorite baseball glove still sat in the hall closet where he'd left it after playing catch with Elena the weekend before he vanished. It was as if he had simply evaporated, leaving behind a family and a life that seemed to have been important to him right up until the moment it apparently wasn't. Elena was 8 when her father disappeared, old enough to understand that Daddy wasn't coming home but too young to understand why. She spent months asking when he'd be back, then months asking where he'd gone, then years asking if it was somehow her fault. I did my best to hold us together, working 2 jobs to keep the house and taking Elena to counseling sessions where she drew pictures of our family with a big empty space where her father should have been. She's 28 now, married to a good man named David, who never knew Marcus but treats Elena like she deserves to be cherished. They live in Portland, Oregon, where she works as a pediatric nurse and calls me every Sunday evening to check in and share stories about her patients. The basement has always been Marcus's domain. When we first bought the house, it was unfinished, just concrete floors and exposed beams. But Marcus had big plans. He was going to create a workshop down there, maybe a family room where Elena could have sleepovers with her friends. He spent weeks that first summer installing proper lighting and insulation, building workbenches and storage shelves, even framing out what would eventually become a half bathroom. But the project was never quite finished when he disappeared, and in the years that followed, I found it too painful to go down there. About 6 months after Marcus vanished, I had the basement sealed off. Not professionally, just practically. I moved furniture in front of the basement door. Told myself I'd deal with it later when I was ready. I had Elena to focus on, bills to pay, a life to rebuild from scratch. The basement became a tomb of unfinished dreams, and I learned to live in the upper floors of my house as if the lower levels simply didn't exist. Over the years, people occasionally asked about the basement. Repair workers who needed to check the furnace or plumbers investigating mysterious leaks would mention that they'd need access to the lower level, and I'd always find a way to redirect them or handle the problem differently. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready to face Marcus's abandoned projects, but the truth was deeper than that. Going into that basement felt like admitting he was really gone, like accepting that the life we'd planned together was truly over. 20 years is a long time to live with a question mark where your husband used to be. Long enough to stop jumping every time the phone rings, thinking it might be news. Long enough to stop seeing his face in crowds, or thinking you hear his laugh in restaurants. Long enough to build a new version of yourself around the absence. To create routines and relationships that don't include the possibility of his return. I'd become someone different than the woman who'd kissed Marcus goodbye that last Tuesday morning. Stronger in some ways, more independent, but also more cautious about trusting that good things would last. I kept busy over the years. I worked as a bookkeeper for a local veterinary clinic, organized charity drives for the women's shelter, maintained friendships with neighbors who'd watched Elena grow up and moved away. I dated occasionally, though never seriously. How do you explain to someone new that you're not divorced or widowed, but something in between? How do you open your heart fully when you've never gotten closure on the last relationship that mattered? The house itself became my anchor and my project. I learned to fix leaky faucets and replace light fixtures, painted every room at least twice, and maintained the garden that Marcus had started but never finished. I upgraded the kitchen appliances one at a time and replaced the old windows with energy-efficient ones that Elena helped me pick out during one of her visits home. The house stayed beautiful and well-maintained, but it also stayed incomplete, like a sentence with a missing word that changes the entire meaning. Elena worried about me living alone in such a big house, especially as I got older. During her last visit at Christmas, she'd gently suggested that maybe it was time to consider something smaller, more manageable. A condo, perhaps, or one of those new senior living communities that felt more like resorts than nursing homes. I'd deflected her concerns with jokes about how I wasn't ready to give up my tomato garden, but privately I'd been wondering the same thing. What was the point of maintaining a house built for a family when I was the only one left living in it? The strange noises started about 3 weeks ago. At first, I dismissed them as the ordinary sounds of an old house settling, pipes expanding and contracting, maybe mice in the walls. Old houses make noise, and after 20 years, I thought I'd heard every creak and groan this place had to offer. But these sounds were different. Rhythmic sometimes, like footsteps. Other times it sounded almost like music, muffled and distant, but definitely there. The sounds always seemed to come from below, from the direction of the sealed basement. I'd find myself pausing in my daily activities, head tilted, listening for something I couldn't quite identify. During the day, when the neighborhood was full of normal sounds like lawnmowers and children playing, I could almost convince myself I was imagining things. But at night, when the world was quiet, the sounds from below seemed clearer, more distinct, impossible to ignore. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, during one of our regular coffee sessions on her back porch. She suggested it might be animals? Raccoons, maybe, or stray cats who'd found a way into the basement through some forgotten opening. It was a reasonable explanation, and I tried to accept it, but deep down I knew it didn't fit. The sounds had a human quality to them, a pattern and purpose that didn't match what you'd expect from wildlife. Last Tuesday, exactly 20 years to the day after Marcus disappeared, I woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the unmistakable sound of a toilet flushing somewhere below me. Not the upstairs bathroom, which was just down the hall from my bedroom, but somewhere deeper in the house. I lay in bed for a long time, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was the pipes, maybe water hammer or some other plumbing issue I didn't understand. But I've lived in this house for over 2 decades, and I know the difference between mechanical sounds and human sounds. The next morning, I called a plumber. Jim Rodriguez had done work on the house before, and I trusted him to be honest about what he found. When he arrived, I explained about the strange sounds and asked him to check for any plumbing issues that might be causing them. He spent an hour going through the house, checking every faucet and toilet, running water and listening for problems. Everything upstairs was functioning perfectly. When Jim asked about accessing the basement to check the main lines, I felt my stomach clench. I explained that the basement had been sealed off for years, that there might be storage issues or other obstacles preventing easy access. He offered to move whatever was blocking the door, said it wouldn't take long to do a basic inspection of the basement plumbing, but I found myself making excuses. I told him I'd need to clear some things out first, that maybe we could schedule another appointment after I'd had time to prepare. Jim looked at me with the kind of expression people get when they're trying to be polite about something that doesn't make sense to them. He left his card and told me to call when I was ready, but I could tell he thought I was being unnecessarily difficult about something simple. After he left, I stood in my living room staring at the furniture I'd arranged in front of the basement door 20 years ago, and realized that I couldn't put this off much longer. That evening, I called Elena. We talked about her work, her husband's recent promotion, the vacation they were planning for next month. Normal conversation, comfortable and familiar. The kind of weekly check-in that had become our routine. But when I was getting ready to hang up, she asked if everything was okay. She said I sounded distracted, maybe a little stressed. I almost told her about the sounds then. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Almost explained about the toilet flushing and the footsteps, and the strange sense I'd been having that something in the house had changed. But how do you tell your daughter, who's built a good life 3,000 miles away, that you think something impossible might be happening in the house where she grew up? How do you admit that you've been avoiding your own basement for 20 years, because you're afraid of what you might find there? Instead, I told her I was fine, maybe just tired from working extra hours at the clinic. She offered to visit sooner than planned, said she could take a few days off and fly out to help with whatever I needed. The concern in her voice made my chest tight with love and guilt. Elena had already sacrificed enough of her life to the mystery of her father's disappearance. I wasn't going to drag her back into that uncertainty unless I absolutely had to. Friday night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from below had been particularly active that evening, almost like a conversation happening in another room. I tried playing music, turning on the television, even running the dishwasher to create background noise, but nothing could completely mask the reality that something was happening in my basement. Something that shouldn't be possible but was becoming harder to deny. I got up around midnight and made myself a cup of chamomile tea, thinking it might help me relax. I was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the water to boil, when I heard it clearly for the first time. A child's voice, high and sweet, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The voice was coming from directly below me, from the basement I'd sealed off 20 years ago, and it was singing a song I recognized because I used to sing it to Elena when she was little. My hands were shaking as I turned off the stove. The house fell silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the rapid beating of my heart. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting to hear the voice again, hoping I'd imagined it but knowing I hadn't. When the singing started again, softer this time but still unmistakably there, I realized that I was going to have to face whatever was in my basement. I spent the rest of that night sitting at my kitchen table, drinking tea and staring at the furniture that blocked the basement door. 20 years of avoidance, 20 years of living half a life in half a house, 20 years of questions that had no answers. As the sun started to rise over Maple Street, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Today, I was going to move that furniture. Today, I was going to open that door. Today, I was going to find out what had been living beneath my feet all this time. But I had no idea that what I found down there would change everything I thought I knew about the last 20 years of my life. I had no idea that my husband hadn't disappeared at all. And I certainly had no idea that the family I thought I'd lost had actually been living right below me, in a basement that had become their entire world, for reasons I was about to discover that would make me question everything I believed about love, sacrifice, and the lengths people will go to protect the ones they care about most. The first thing I did Saturday morning was call in sick to work. I'd never used a personal day for something like this, but Dr. Martinez had always been understanding about family emergencies, and in a way, that's exactly what this was. I told his receptionist I had a plumbing crisis that needed immediate attention, which wasn't entirely a lie. Something was definitely wrong with my house, even if it wasn't the pipes. I spent the morning drinking coffee and staring at the barricade I'd built in front of the basement door. Over the years, it had become an elaborate fortress of denial. My grandmother's antique secretary desk sat directly against the door, flanked by two heavy bookcases filled with Elena's childhood books and my collection of gardening magazines. A wooden trunk that held Christmas decorations completed the wall, and I'd even hung a large mirror above it all to make it look intentional, like a deliberate decorating choice rather than an emotional barrier. Moving everything would take time and energy, but more than that, it would require me to confront 20 years of avoidance. Each piece of furniture represented a decision to look away, to choose ignorance over truth. The secretary desk was the first thing I'd moved there, just days after Marcus disappeared, when his empty workshop below felt too raw to face. The bookcases came later, when Elena went to college and I needed somewhere to store her childhood things. The Christmas trunk was the most recent addition, placed there 5 years ago, when I finally admitted I wasn't going to decorate the basement for the holidays anymore. I started with the mirror, carefully lifting it down and carrying it to the living room. It was heavier than I remembered, and my arms shook slightly as I leaned it against the wall. 20 years ago, I'd been stronger, more resilient, in the way that comes from necessity, when you're a single mother holding everything together. Now, at 62, I had to pace myself differently, think about my back and my balance in ways I'd never had to consider before. The Christmas trunk was next. It rolled on small wheels, which made it easier to maneuver, but the contents shifted and rattled as I guided it across the hardwood floor. I could hear ornaments clinking together inside, delicate things that Marcus and I had collected during our early years of marriage. We'd bought our first Christmas ornament together on our honeymoon in Vermont, a small wooden angel carved by a local artisan. It was probably still in there somewhere, wrapped in tissue paper, waiting for a holiday celebration that might never come. The bookcases required emptying first. I made stack after stack of books on the kitchen table, each one triggering a memory I'd tried to bury. Elena's copy of Where the Wild Things Are with crayon marks on page 12, where she'd tried to color Max's costume. The gardening guide Marcus gave me for my birthday the year before he disappeared, bookmarked at the section on growing herbs. A collection of mystery novels I'd read during the long, sleepless nights in those first months after he vanished, when I'd needed something to occupy my mind besides worry and speculation. By noon, I'd created a pathway to the basement door, but the secretary desk still stood guard like a final sentry. It was the heaviest piece, solid oak with drawers full of important papers and family documents. I'd inherited it from my grandmother, who'd used it to write letters to relatives scattered across Ireland, and to keep track of household expenses in her careful, precise handwriting. Moving it would require strategy. I emptied the drawers first, creating neat piles of documents on the dining room table. Birth certificates, insurance policies, Elena's school records, medical files, tax returns going back decades. The mundane paperwork of a life lived responsibly, bills paid on time, important documents kept safe and organized. Among the papers, I found things I'd forgotten I'd saved. Elena's first-grade report card, where her teacher had written, "Elena is a joy to have in class and shows exceptional kindness to her classmates." A sympathy card from Marcus's brother Danny, sent after the memorial service we'd held 2 years after the disappearance, when we'd finally accepted that hope was becoming a form of torture. At the bottom of the deepest drawer, wrapped in a cloth bag I recognized from my grandmother's sewing basket, I found Marcus's wedding ring. I'd forgotten I'd put it there, removed from his nightstand drawer during one of those terrible early days when seeing it every morning felt like swallowing glass. I held it now in my palm, surprised by how small it looked, how light it felt. For a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life, Marcus had had elegant fingers, and he'd worn this simple gold band with pride. He'd never taken it off, not even when he was working on particularly dirty or dangerous projects. Finding the ring stopped me cold. I sat on the floor beside the empty secretary desk, holding this small circle of gold and remembering the day we'd bought it together at a little jewelry store in downtown Hartford. We'd been so young, so certain about everything. Marcus had insisted on the traditional vows, the part about "until death do us part," and we'd both believed we understood what that meant. We'd thought death would come naturally, eventually, after decades of shared life and accumulated memories. We'd never imagined that death could be ambiguous, that "until death do us part" could become a question rather than a promise. I slipped the ring into my pocket and returned to the task of moving the desk. It took another hour and some creative maneuvering with dish towels to protect the floor, but eventually I managed to slide it away from the basement door. The door itself looked smaller than I remembered, painted white to match the rest of the trim in the house, with a simple brass knob that had probably been installed when the house was built in 1923. For a long moment, I just stared at that door. Behind it lay not just a basement, but 20 years of avoided grief, unanswered questions, and memories I'd been too afraid to face. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, a rapid rhythm that reminded me of the panic attacks I'd experienced in those first months after Marcus disappeared. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that whatever was behind this door had a logical explanation. Squirrels, maybe, or settling foundation that created sounds I'd misinterpreted. The sounds I'd been hearing couldn't possibly be what they seemed to be. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. For several minutes, there was nothing but the normal silence of an empty house. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like water running through pipes, followed by the distinctive sound of a door closing. Not a cabinet door or a closet door, but the solid, final sound of someone moving through a space with purpose and familiarity. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it slowly, half expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily with a soft click. The hinges creaked as the door swung inward, and I was hit immediately by a smell I hadn't anticipated. Not the musty, stale air you'd expect from a space that had been sealed for 20 years, but something warmer and more complex. Cooking smells, faint but unmistakable, onions and herbs, maybe soup simmering somewhere in the distance. The basement steps were exactly as I remembered them. Wooden treads that Marcus had installed himself, with a sturdy handrail he'd sanded smooth and painted white. But where I expected to see darkness and dust, there was light filtering up from below. Not electric light, but the warm, flickering glow that comes from candles or oil lamps. And with the light came sounds that made my legs feel weak and unsteady. A woman's voice, humming softly. The clink of dishes being washed. And underneath it all, the kind of quiet domestic symphony that comes from a family going about their daily routine. Someone was living down there. Someone had been living in my basement, and from the sounds of it, they'd been doing it for a very long time. I gripped the handrail and started down the steps, moving as quietly as I could manage. Each step felt like descending into a different world, a parallel universe where the last 20 years had unfolded according to a completely different script. The wooden steps didn't creak the way they used to, and I realized that someone had maintained them, probably oiled them regularly to prevent the noise that might give away their presence. Halfway down the stairs I could see into the basement, and what I saw made me sit down hard on the step, gripping the handrail to keep from falling. The space that had been Marcus's unfinished workshop when I'd last seen it had been transformed into something that looked like a comfortable underground apartment. The concrete walls had been covered with wood paneling, and colorful rugs covered most of the floor. There was furniture that I didn't recognize, a sofa and chairs arranged around a coffee table, bookshelves lined with what looked like hundreds of books, and in one corner, a kitchen area with a small refrigerator, hot plate, and sink. But it was the photographs that made my heart stop beating. Covering nearly every available wall space were pictures, hundreds of them, and in every single photo was Marcus. Marcus, looking older than when he'd disappeared, his hair grayer and his face more lined, but unmistakably, impossibly Marcus. Marcus with his arm around a woman I'd never seen before, a pretty brunette who looked to be in her 40s. Marcus holding a little girl who had his same dark eyes and stubborn chin. Marcus at what looked like birthday parties. Christmas mornings, family picnics, living a life that should have been impossible. I must have made some sound, because the humming stopped abruptly. The woman's voice called out something in a language I didn't recognize, and I heard footsteps moving toward the bottom of the stairs. My first instinct was to run, to go back upstairs and pretend I'd never seen any of this, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I sat frozen on the step, watching as a woman appeared at the bottom of the staircase. She was small and delicate, with long dark hair pulled back in a braid and wearing a simple blue dress that looked handmade. When she saw me sitting on the stairs, her face went through a series of expressions that I recognized because I was probably experiencing the same ones. Shock, fear, confusion, and then something that looked almost like relief. "You're Geraldine?" she said, and her voice had a slight accent that I couldn't place. Not Spanish, maybe something Eastern European. "He said you might come down here someday." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman took a few steps closer to the bottom of the stairs, moving carefully as if I might bolt if she approached too quickly. "My name is Katya," she said. "I think we need to talk." Before I could respond, I heard another voice from somewhere deeper in the basement. A child's voice, the same high, sweet voice I'd heard singing lullabies through my kitchen floor. "Mama, who is that lady on the stairs?" And then, from an area of the basement I couldn't see, came a voice that made the world tilt sideways beneath me. A voice I'd heard in my dreams for 20 years. A voice I'd memorized in every tone and inflection. A voice that belonged to a man who was supposed to be dead or disappeared or anywhere in the world except in my basement. "That's my wife," Marcus said, and then he stepped into view at the bottom of the stairs, looking exactly like himself but 20 years older, wearing clothes I'd never seen and an expression of such profound sadness that it took my breath away. "Hello, Gerry. I've been waiting for you to find us." The basement went completely silent, except for the sound of my own breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. I stared at Marcus. This impossible vision of my husband, who had been gone for 2 decades but was standing in my basement looking like he'd aged naturally through all the years I'd spent grieving him. His hair was completely gray now, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he disappeared. But he moved with the same easy confidence I remembered. He was wearing a green flannel shirt and jeans, both clean and well-maintained, and on his left hand, I could see the pale band of skin where his wedding ring used to be. "This isn't real," I whispered, and my voice sounded strange and distant even to myself. "This can't be real." Marcus took a step toward the stairs but stopped when I instinctively leaned back. "I know how this looks, Gerry. I know how impossible this must seem." "You're dead," I said louder now, and the words echoed off the basement walls. "You've been dead for 20 years. I had a memorial service. Elena grew up without a father. You're dead." "I'm not dead," Marcus said quietly. "I never died. I've been here the whole time." The woman, Katya, moved to stand beside him, and I could see now that she was pregnant, probably about 6 months along based on the way she carried herself. The little girl I'd heard singing appeared from behind a partition I hadn't noticed before, a beautiful child with Marcus's dark hair and Katya's delicate features. She looked to be about 7 or 8, and she was staring at me with the curious, unafraid gaze of a child who had lived her entire life in the strange safety of this underground world. "This is Sophia," Marcus said, his hand resting protectively on the little girl's shoulder. "And Katya is—" He paused, looking at the woman with an expression I recognized because he used to look at me the same way. "Katya is my wife." Those 3 words hit me like physical blows. My wife. Not my friend or someone who's been helping me, or any of the dozen explanations my mind was frantically trying to construct. My wife, which meant that while I'd been living alone upstairs, grieving and struggling and rebuilding my life around his absence, Marcus had been building a completely different life 20 feet below me. "How long?" I asked, and my voice cracked on the words. Marcus looked at Katya, and some silent communication passed between them. "Sophia is 7, he said finally, 7 years old, which meant that not only had Marcus been alive all this time, but he'd been starting a new family while I'd still been putting up missing person flyers and calling Detective Rivera every week for updates on his case. I stood up on shaky legs, gripping the handrail so tightly that my knuckles were white. I need to understand this. I need to understand all of this. Why are you here? Why did you let me think you were dead? Why did you let Elena grow up thinking her father had abandoned her? It's complicated, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like shame. Complicated, I repeated, and I could hear my voice getting louder, more shrill. Complicated? You disappeared. You vanished without a trace, and left your family to wonder what happened to you for 20 years. That's not complicated, Marcus. That's cruel. Sophia moved closer to Katya, obviously disturbed by the tone of my voice, and something about her instinctive fear of me made me feel ashamed of my anger, even though I had every right to it. Please, Katya said, speaking for the first time since she'd introduced herself. Please come down. Let us explain. There are things you don't know, things that Marcus couldn't tell you before. I looked at the three of them standing at the bottom of my basement stairs like some impossible family portrait, and I realized that whatever explanation they gave me was going to change everything I thought I knew about my life. There would be no going back to the woman I'd been an hour ago, the woman who'd lived for 20 years with an unsolved mystery. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who had to face a truth that was somehow worse than anything I'd imagined during my darkest moments of wondering. I'll come down, I said finally. But I want answers. I want all of them. Marcus nodded, and for the first time since I'd seen him, he smiled slightly. It was the same smile that had made me fall in love with him 30 years ago, and seeing it now, in this impossible context, made my chest hurt with a complicated mixture of joy and betrayal that I didn't know how to process. I descended the rest of the stairs on unsteady legs, and as I reached the bottom, I got my first full view of what Marcus had built down here. It wasn't just a hiding place or a temporary shelter. It was a home, complete and comfortable and obviously designed to house a family for an extended period of time. There were children's drawings taped to the walls alongside the photographs, a small dining table with 4 chairs, and in one corner, what looked like a makeshift classroom with a small desk and educational materials. You've been homeschooling her, I said, looking at Sophia, who was still watching me with cautious interest. We had to, Katya replied. It wasn't safe for her to go to regular school. Safe from what? I asked, and then I looked directly at Marcus. What happened to you? Why did you disappear? Why are you hiding in my basement like some kind of criminal? Marcus gestured toward the seating area. Sit down, Gerry, please. This is going to take a while to explain. I remained standing, my arms crossed defensively across my chest. Start talking. Marcus looked at Katya again, and she nodded encouragingly. The morning I disappeared, he began, I was supposed to meet with a new client, a man named Vincent Torino, who wanted work done on his house in Waterbury. But when I got to the address he'd given me, it wasn't a house. It was a warehouse, and Vincent Torino wasn't a homeowner looking for renovation work. What was he? I asked, though I was beginning to have a terrible suspicion about where this story was going. He was connected to some very dangerous people, Marcus said. People who were using legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering operations. Vincent thought I was someone else. Someone who was supposed to be helping them move money through construction contracts. When I showed up instead, confused about the mix-up, I saw and heard things I wasn't supposed to see or hear. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of things? Names, dates, amounts of money. Details about operations that could have put a lot of powerful people in prison if they ever came to light. Katya had moved to stand behind Sophia, her hands resting protectively on the little girl's shoulders. Tell her about the threat, she said quietly. Marcus's face darkened. Vincent made it very clear that if I ever spoke about what I'd witnessed, if I ever went to the police or tried to use the information against them, they would hurt you and Elena. Not just threaten you, Gerry, hurt you. Kill you. The basement felt like it was spinning around me. So you just disappeared? You just let us think you were dead instead of going to the police? I tried to figure out another way, Marcus said, and his voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't identify. I spent days trying to think of some solution that would keep you and Elena safe while still allowing me to come home. But Vincent made sure I understood that these weren't empty threats. He showed me photographs of other people who'd seen too much. People who'd thought they could outsmart the organization or go to the authorities for protection. What happened to those people? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. They disappeared, Marcus said simply, along with their families. Vincent was very specific about that. He said that if I caused problems for them, you and Elena would disappear the same way, and no one would ever find your bodies. I sank into one of the chairs, my legs finally giving out completely. So you decided to disappear instead. I left my truck at that rest stop and started walking, Marcus said. I'd taken some cash out of the bank that morning, enough to survive for a while. I thought maybe I could find a way to contact the FBI, give them the information I had in exchange for protection for you and Elena. But when I tried to reach out to federal authorities, I learned that Vincent's organization had connections in law enforcement. People on the payroll, people who would report back if anyone started asking questions about them. How did you end up here? I asked, gesturing around the basement. How did you end up living in your own house without anyone knowing? I didn't at first, Marcus replied. I spent almost a year living in cheap motels and shelters, trying to figure out what to do next. I watched you and Elena from a distance sometimes, making sure you were safe, but I could never get close enough to make contact. And then I realized that Vincent's people had probably stopped watching you actively once they were convinced I was really gone. So you came home. I broke into my own house, Marcus said with a bitter laugh, late one night when you and Elena were asleep upstairs. I knew about the basement access from the outside, the old coal chute that we'd never properly sealed. I managed to get down here without making noise, and I realized that this could work as a hiding place, at least temporarily. Temporarily, I repeated. It's been 20 years, Marcus. I know, he said quietly. I know how long it's been. I've counted every day. Sophia tugged on Katya's dress and whispered something in what sounded like Russian. Katya nodded and guided the little girl toward what looked like a play area in one corner of the basement. Where does Katya fit into this? I asked when Sophia was out of earshot. Marcus and Katya exchanged another look, and I could see the deep affection between them, the kind of connection that comes from shared experiences and mutual dependence. I met Katya about 8 years ago, Marcus said. She was working as a translator for an immigration lawyer, helping people who were trying to escape dangerous situations in their home countries. When I first approached her for help, I was hoping she could connect me with someone who understood how to disappear completely, how to start over somewhere safe. But instead, she helped you stay hidden here. She understood what it meant to live in fear, Katya said, speaking up for the first time since she'd introduced herself. In my country, I had seen what happens to families when dangerous people decide they are threats. When Marcus told me his story, I knew he was telling the truth. So you just moved into my basement with him? Not right away, Katya said. At first, I was just helping him improve his hiding place, making it more livable for long-term survival. But as time went on, we became close. They fell in love, Sophia said from her play area, apparently still listening despite the distance. Papa told me the story. It's very romantic. I looked at this little girl who had spent her entire life in my basement, who called my husband Papa and thought his story was romantic. And I felt something break inside my chest. Not just my heart, though that was certainly breaking, but something deeper. The foundation of my understanding of my own life. The bedrock of everything I thought I knew about love and marriage and loss. When were you married? I asked, and my voice sounded hollow even to myself. We're not, Marcus said quickly. I mean, not legally. I'm still married to you, Gerry. I never filed for divorce. I never could have, without revealing where I was. But you call her your wife. Because that's what she is to me, Marcus said, and the gentle way he looked at Katya when he said it was like another physical blow. She's the mother of my child, the person who shared my life for the past 8 years. She's my partner in every way that matters. Except legally. Except legally. I stood up again and walked over to look at the photographs covering the walls. Pictures of birthdays and holidays. Of Sophia learning to walk and losing her first tooth. Of Marcus teaching her to read and Katya braiding her hair. An entire family history that had played out 20 feet below my bedroom, while I'd slept alone and dreamed about a husband who was building a life with someone else. "You were so close," I said, touching one of the photos. "All these years, you were right here." "I know," Marcus said, and when I turned around, I could see that he was crying. "Do you think this was easy for me? Do you think I wanted to live like this? Hiding in my own house, listening to you walk around upstairs and knowing I could never hold you again. But you found someone else to hold instead. That's not fair, Gerry." "Fair?" I laughed, and it was a harsh, bitter sound. "You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been telling me the truth 20 years ago. Fair would have been letting me make my own choice about whether I wanted to live in danger or live without you. Fair would have been giving Elena the chance to know her father instead of letting her grow up thinking he'd abandoned her." "I was protecting you," Marcus said, and his voice was getting louder, more defensive. "You were protecting yourself," I shot back. "You were taking the easy way out, letting us grieve for you instead of figuring out how to fight for your family." Sophia had gone very quiet in her corner, and Katya was watching our argument with an expression of deep concern. I realized that this little girl had probably never heard adults raise their voices at each other, had grown up in this strange, insulated world where conflict was kept to a minimum because there was nowhere to escape to. I took a deep breath and lowered my voice. "I need some time to process this," I said. "I need to think about what this means and what happens next." "What do you want to happen next?" Marcus asked. It was a reasonable question, but I had no idea how to answer it. "What do you want when you discover that your dead husband is alive but living with another family? What do you want when you learn that the man you've mourned for 20 years chose to let you mourn, rather than trust you with the truth? What do you want when your entire understanding of your own life turns out to be based on a lie?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what I want or what I feel or what any of this means. I just know that I can't pretend I didn't see this. I can't go back upstairs and act like everything is normal." "We don't expect you to," Katya said gently. "We've always known that someday this would happen. We've been preparing for it." "Preparing how?" "We have plans," Marcus said. "Ways to disappear completely if we need to. New identities, money saved, transportation arranged. We can be gone within a few hours if necessary." "Is that what you want to do?" Marcus looked at Katya and Sophia, then back at me. "I don't know either," he said. "I'd given up hope that we'd ever be able to live any other way. But now that you know the truth, maybe there are other possibilities." "Like what?" "Like maybe it's time to stop hiding," Katya said. "Maybe it's time to find out if the people who threatened us 20 years ago are still a danger, or if enough time has passed that we could find a way to live in the open." I thought about Vincent Torino and his organization, about whether the same people were still in power after 2 decades, about whether the information Marcus had learned that day was still relevant or dangerous. "We need help," I said finally. "We need someone who understands how these things work, someone who can investigate whether it's safe for you to stop hiding." "Who would we trust with something like that?" Marcus asked. I thought about Detective Rivera, who had worked Marcus's missing person case for 2 years, and had always seemed genuinely committed to finding the truth. He was retired now, but he'd kept in touch occasionally, sending me updates when similar cases crossed his desk, or calling on the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance to see how I was doing. "I might know someone," I said. "Someone who's already invested in this case and who might be willing to help us figure out what's possible." For the first time since I'd discovered them, I saw something that looked like hope in Marcus's eyes. "You'd be willing to do that?" he asked. "Even after everything I've put you through?" I looked around the basement again, at this impossible family that had been living beneath my feet, at the life Marcus had built while I'd been living half a life upstairs. I thought about Elena, who deserved to know that her father was alive, and about Sophia, who deserved to see sunlight and attend real school and have friends her own age. I thought about Katya, who had spent 8 years hiding underground, and about the baby she was carrying who might be born into the same confined existence. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can ever understand why you made the choices you made or why you didn't trust me enough to include me in them. But I can't leave things like this. Too many people have already sacrificed too much." Marcus nodded, and I could see the relief in his posture. "Thank you, Gerry, for everything." I looked at him standing there beside the woman he called his wife and the daughter he'd never been able to acknowledge, and I realized that whatever happened next, our story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. I spent that night in my own bed for the first time in 20 years, knowing that my husband was sleeping directly below me with another woman. The ceiling above their bedroom area was also the floor beneath my feet, and every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The soft murmur of their voices as they talked late into the night, the creak of their bed when one of them shifted position, even the gentle breathing that spoke of people who had learned to sleep peacefully despite living in constant hiding. I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling and trying to process the impossible reality of my situation. Marcus was alive. He had been alive every single day for the past 20 years while I had grieved him, while Elena had grown up fatherless, while I had slowly rebuilt my life around his absence. But he wasn't just alive, he was living a completely different life with a completely different family, and somehow that felt worse than if he had actually died. The rational part of my mind understood his explanation. Dangerous criminals had threatened to kill me and Elena if he ever revealed what he'd witnessed. He had disappeared to protect us, sacrificing his own freedom and happiness to keep us safe. It was even romantic in a tragic sort of way, the kind of noble sacrifice that belonged in movies and novels. But the emotional part of my mind couldn't get past the fundamental betrayal of it all. He had made a unilateral decision about our lives without consulting us, without giving us the chance to choose danger over abandonment. Around 3 a.m, I heard Sophia crying softly. The sound was muffled but distinct, the kind of worried sobbing that comes from a child who has overheard adult conversations she doesn't fully understand but knows are important. I heard Marcus's voice, low and soothing, talking to her in the gentle tone I remembered from when Elena was small and had nightmares. The familiarity of that tone made my chest ache with a loneliness I hadn't felt in years. By dawn, I had made several decisions. First, I was going to contact Detective Rivera and ask for his help in investigating whether Vincent Torino and his organization were still a threat. Second, I was going to call Elena and tell her that her father was alive, because she deserved to know the truth, even if it complicated her life. Third, I was going to figure out some way to help Katya and Sophia live safely in the world above ground, because no child should have to spend her entire life hiding in a basement. What I hadn't decided was what any of this meant for Marcus and me. Were we still married in any meaningful sense? Was I supposed to welcome him back into my life as if the past 20 years hadn't happened? Was I expected to accept Katya as his second wife and Sophia as my stepdaughter? The legal and emotional complexities seemed overwhelming, and I had no framework for understanding how to navigate them. I made coffee at sunrise and sat at my kitchen table with Detective Rivera's business card, which I'd kept in my address book all these years. He'd given it to me during one of our last meetings, back when the official investigation was winding down, and told me to call him if I ever heard anything or just needed someone to talk to who understood the case. I'd called him a few times over the years, usually on the anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, and he'd always been kind and patient, even though he was officially retired. At 8 o'clock, I dialed his number. It rang 4 times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. Rivera. Detective Rivera, this is Geraldine Murphy, Marcus Murphy's wife. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him shifting mental gears. Gerry, hello. It's been a while. How are you holding up? Actually, I'm calling because there's been a development in Marcus's case. A significant development. Another pause. Longer this time. What kind of development? I took a deep breath. I found him. He's alive. The silence that followed stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Rivera spoke, and his voice had taken on the careful, professional tone I remembered from the early days of the investigation. Gerry, I need you to tell me exactly what's happened. Everything. From the beginning. I spent the next 30 minutes explaining about the sounds in the basement, my decision to investigate, and the shocking discovery of Marcus living underground with Katya and Sophia. Rivera listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds that indicated he was taking notes. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This Vincent Torino," he said finally. "Do you remember any other names Marcus mentioned? Any details about the organization? He said they were using construction contracts for money laundering, but he didn't give me many specifics. He was more focused on explaining why he couldn't go to the police. And he's been living in your basement for 20 years. Not the entire time. He said he spent almost a year in motels and shelters before he figured out how to access the basement from the outside." Rivera was quiet again, and I could hear him tapping a pen against something hard. "Gerry, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe him? Do you believe that he was really protecting you and Elena? Or is it possible that he disappeared for other reasons and this story about criminal threats is something he's constructed to justify his actions?" The question caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. Of course Rivera would approach this with professional skepticism. Marcus could be lying about the whole thing. Maybe he'd had an affair with Katya and decided to fake his own death rather than face the consequences. Maybe he'd been involved in something illegal himself and had to disappear. Maybe this story about Vincent Torino was elaborate fiction designed to make himself look like a noble sacrifice rather than a selfish deserter. But as I thought about it, I realized that I did believe him. Not because I wanted to, or because it made me feel better about what he'd done, but because the details were too specific, and the fear in his voice had been too real. Marcus had always been a terrible liar, unable to maintain eye contact when he was being dishonest about even small things. The man I'd confronted in the basement had been many things, but he hadn't been lying. "I believe him," I said finally. "I don't like what he did, and I don't understand why he didn't trust me enough to include me in the decision, but I believe the threats were real." "All right, then we need to figure out if they're still real. I'm gonna make some calls, do some research into Vincent Torino, and see what I can find out about his current status. In the meantime, I need you to be very careful about who you tell about this. If Marcus is right about these people having connections in law enforcement, we don't want word getting back to them before we know what we're dealing with. What about Elena? She has a right to know that her father is alive." "She does," Rivera agreed. "But maybe wait a few days until I can gather some information. If we're going to bring this into the open, we need to do it carefully and safely." After I hung up with Rivera, I went downstairs to the basement. Marcus was alone in the main living area, reading a book while Katya and Sophia were in what appeared to be the bedroom area, separated from the rest of the space by a heavy curtain. He looked up when I reached the bottom of the stairs, and I could see the exhaustion in his face. He probably hadn't slept any better than I had. "I called Detective Rivera," I said without preamble. Marcus closed his book and set it aside. "What did you tell him?" "Everything. He's going to investigate Vincent Torino and see if the threats are still valid." "And if they are?" I sat down across from him, maintaining careful distance between us. "Then we'll figure out what to do next. But if they're not, if enough time has passed, or if the organization has been disbanded, or if Vincent is dead, then you're going to have to figure out how to live in the world again." Marcus nodded slowly. "I've thought about that over the years, about what it would mean to stop hiding. But I've also gotten used to this life, strange as that probably sounds. There's a safety in invisibility, a peace in knowing that no one can find you or hurt the people you love. Except that you're not really living," I pointed out. "You're existing. Katya is existing. Sophia has never lived at all, not really. She's 7 years old, and she's never been to a playground or a movie theater or even a grocery store. She's safe. She's isolated. There's a difference." We sat in silence for a few minutes, and I found myself studying Marcus's face, looking for traces of the man I'd married 30 years ago. He was definitely older, more weathered, and there was a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But his hands were the same, still strong and capable from years of working with tools. And he still had the habit of running his fingers through his hair when he was thinking hard about something. "Tell me about your life upstairs," he said suddenly. "Tell me what the last 20 years have been like for you." It was such an unexpected request that I didn't know how to respond at first. What could I possibly say that would convey 2 decades of single parenthood, loneliness, grief, and slow healing? How do you summarize 20 years of learning to be someone new, while never quite letting go of who you used to be? It was hard, I said finally. Especially the first few years, when Elena was still young and asking when you were coming home. I had to work 2 jobs to keep the house, and there were times when I wasn't sure we were going to make it financially. Marcus winced. I had some money saved, but I couldn't access it without revealing that I was alive. I know. I figured that out eventually. What I never figured out was why you couldn't trust me enough to let me help you find another solution. I was terrified, Marcus said, and his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. Vincent showed me pictures, Gerry. Pictures of people who had been killed for knowing too much, and pictures of their families, children, wives, parents. He made it very clear that if I caused problems for them, you and Elena would suffer the consequences. So you chose to make us suffer different consequences instead. I chose to make you safe. You chose to make yourself feel like a hero instead of dealing with the messiness of including your family in a difficult decision. Marcus looked stung by that, and part of me was glad. I'd been polite and controlled during our initial confrontation, but I was still furious with him for the presumption of his choice, for the way he'd decided what was best for all of us without consulting any of us. That's not fair, he said. None of this is fair, Marcus. It wasn't fair to Elena to grow up without a father. It wasn't fair to me to spend 20 years wondering if my husband was dead or if he'd chosen to leave us. And it's not fair to Katya and Sophia to live their entire lives hiding underground because of something that happened before Sophia was even born. I know, Marcus said, and his voice broke slightly. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think there's been a single day in the past 20 years when I haven't wondered if I made the right choice? But you never changed your mind. Even after you met Katya, even after Sophia was born, you never once considered the possibility that the threat might have diminished, or that there might be other ways to handle the situation. I couldn't take that risk, not with their lives. But you could take the risk with mine and Elena's emotional well-being. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked over to one of the walls covered with photographs. Do you want to know what my life has been like down here? He asked, his back still turned to me. Do you want to know what it's like to listen to your wife walking around upstairs every day, knowing that you're 20 feet away but might as well be on another planet? Do you want to know what it's like to hear your daughter crying after a nightmare and not be able to comfort her because you're dead to her? I joined him at the photo wall, studying the images of the life he'd built with Katya and Sophia. They looked happy in most of the pictures, but there was something constrained about their happiness. Something that spoke of joy carved out of very limited circumstances. You weren't dead to Elena, I said. You were missing. There's a difference. Missing means there's still hope, still a possibility that someday you'll come home. Dead means you can grieve and move on. You left us in limbo, Marcus. You condemned us to 20 years of not knowing. I thought it would be easier for you to move on if you thought I was dead. Then you don't understand grief at all. And you definitely don't understand love. Katya appeared from behind the curtain, moving quietly and carrying a cup of what smelled like herbal tea. She nodded at me politely and sat down in one of the chairs, obviously planning to stay for the rest of our conversation. I'm sorry, she said, her accent making the words sound more formal than they probably were. I don't mean to intrude, but I think it's important for me to understand what's happening. I looked at this woman who had shared my husband for 8 years, who was carrying his child, who had chosen to live underground rather than live without him. She was beautiful in a quiet, understated way, and there was an intelligence in her eyes that reminded me of Elena. How did you meet him? I asked. I was working with refugee families, Katya said. People who had fled dangerous situations in their home countries and were trying to establish new lives here. Marcus came to my office asking for help with documentation, with ways to disappear completely. When I heard his story, I recognized the fear in his voice because I had heard it before from my clients. And you believed him. I believed him because I had seen what happens when powerful people decide that someone knows too much. In my country, people disappear all the time for much less than what Marcus witnessed. So you helped him. At first, I just helped him make his hiding place more livable. Better insulation, a way to heat the space in winter, a system for getting fresh water. But as time went on, she paused and looked at Marcus with obvious affection. We became friends, and then more than friends. Even though he was married. Katya's cheeks flushed slightly. Marcus told me about you from the beginning. He showed me pictures, told me stories about your life together. I knew that if he could ever find a way to be safe, he would go back to you. But he didn't find a way. And after several years, we had to make a choice about whether to continue living separately in the same small space, or to accept that this might be our only chance at happiness. I looked back and forth between them, these two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, and I realized that I couldn't summon the righteous anger I wanted to feel. What they had done was wrong by any conventional moral standard, but it was also understandable given the impossible situation they'd been living in. What about Sophia? I asked. Was she planned? Marcus and Katya exchanged a look, and I could see a whole conversation pass between them in that glance. Not exactly planned, Marcus said, but not unwelcome either. When we realized Katya was pregnant, we had to decide whether to try to find a way for her to leave and have the baby somewhere else, or to commit to raising a child down here. And you chose to raise her here. We chose to stay together, Katya said firmly. Whatever that meant. I thought about Sophia, this bright, curious little girl who had never seen a sunset or felt rain on her face, who had learned to read from underground books and sing lullabies that echoed off concrete walls. She's going to need more than this, I said. She's going to need friends and school and experiences that you can't give her down here. We know, Marcus said. That's part of why we've been preparing to leave if necessary. We've been teaching her about the outside world, preparing her for the possibility that someday we might have to live differently. And the new baby? Katya's hand moved instinctively to her belly. This baby will be born into whatever world we can create by then. Hopefully, a safer world than the one Sophia was born into. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Rivera's name appeared on the screen, and I answered quickly. What did you find out? I asked without preamble. Quite a bit, actually. Vincent Torino died of a heart attack 8 years ago. His organization was disbanded about 5 years ago, when the FBI finally built a strong enough case to prosecute the major players. Most of them are in federal prison now. I felt my knees go weak with relief. So the threat is over. The original threat is definitely over. But, Gerry, there's something else you need to know. When I started digging into this case, I discovered that there have been periodic inquiries about Marcus over the years. Someone has been looking for him. My blood went cold. What kind of inquiries? Private investigator stuff, mostly. Someone hiring people to check public records, follow up on old leads, that sort of thing. The most recent inquiry was about 6 months ago. Who's been looking for him? That's what I'm still trying to figure out. The inquiries have been routed through several different agencies, and whoever is behind them has been careful to maintain their anonymity. But Gerry, if someone has been actively searching for Marcus all these years, it suggests that his disappearance might not be as simple as he's told you. I looked at Marcus, who was watching my face intently, obviously trying to read my side of the conversation from my expressions. What are you suggesting? I asked Rivera. I'm suggesting that before Marcus comes out of hiding, we need to figure out who's been looking for him and why. Because if it's law enforcement, that might be one thing. But if it's connected to his original disappearance in some way, it could still be dangerous. How long will it take you to find out? Give me a few more days. In the meantime, keep this information to yourself. Don't tell Marcus what I've told you until we know more. Why not? Because if he's been lying to you about why he disappeared, I don't want him to have time to come up with a new story. After I hung up, Marcus immediately asked what Rivera had learned. I looked at him, this man I'd loved and lost and found again, and I realized that Detective Rivera was right to be suspicious. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the story that didn't quite fit together. He's still investigating, I said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. He needs a few more days to get a complete picture. Marcus nodded, but I could see disappointment in his face. After 20 years of hiding, a few more days probably felt like an eternity. "There's something else we need to talk about," I said. "Elena. She needs to know that you're alive, regardless of what Rivera finds out about the current threat level." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I've been thinking about that all night. How do you tell your daughter that her father has been alive for 20 years but chose not to contact her?" "Very carefully," I said, "and with a lot of support." Katya had been listening to our conversation with obvious concern. "What will happen to us?" she asked. "If Marcus goes back to his old life, what happens to Sophia and me?" It was a fair question, and one that I'd been avoiding thinking about. If Marcus emerged from hiding, if he resumed his legal identity and his place in the world, what would that mean for the family he'd built underground? Would Katya and Sophia be relegated to the status of mistress and illegitimate child? Would Marcus have to choose between his old life and his new one? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think we're going to have to figure out something that's never been figured out before." "What do you mean?" I looked around the basement, at this strange underground world where impossible things had become routine, where love had flourished in the most unlikely circumstances, where a family had been born from secrecy and fear. "I mean that none of us fit into normal categories anymore," I said. "Marcus isn't just a missing person who's been found. I'm not just a wife whose husband has returned. You're not just the other woman, and Sophia isn't just the other child. We're something new, something that doesn't have a name or a precedent. So what do? We figure it out as we go," I said. "We make decisions based on what's best for everyone involved, especially the children. We try to build something that honors the past without being trapped by it." Marcus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You'd be willing to do that? To find a way for all of us to coexist?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm willing to try to figure out what's possible. For Elena's sake, and for Sophia's sake, and for the new baby's sake." Katya started crying then, quiet tears that spoke of relief and gratitude, and probably a dozen other emotions I couldn't begin to identify. Marcus moved to sit beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture so familiar and comfortable that it made my chest ache. But as I watched them together, I realized that my grief wasn't just about losing Marcus anymore. It was about losing the simplicity of that loss, the clean boundaries of widowhood, the clear narrative of a woman who had loved and lost and learned to build a new life from the pieces. Now I had to figure out how to build something entirely different, something that had never been built before. And I had to do it while wondering if the man at the center of it all had been telling me the truth about anything. The call from Rivera came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after our conversation about the mysterious inquiries. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, listening to the familiar sounds of the underground family beginning their day below me. Sophia's bright chatter as she helped Katya prepare breakfast, Marcus's deeper voice reading something aloud, the domestic symphony that had been playing beneath my feet for years without my knowledge. "Gerry, I need to see you in person," Rivera said without his usual pleasantries. "And I need to see Marcus too. Can you meet me somewhere private where we won't be overheard?" The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench. "What did you find out?" "Not over the phone. Is there somewhere we can talk safely?" I thought about it for a moment. The basement seemed like the obvious choice, but bringing an outsider into Marcus's hiding place felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. At the same time, if Rivera had discovered something important, we needed to hear it. "Can you come to the house?" I asked finally. "We can talk in the basement where Marcus is staying." "I'll be there in an hour. Gerry, don't mention this call to Marcus until I arrive. I want to see his reaction to what I've learned." That directive sent ice through my veins. If Rivera was concerned about Marcus's reaction, it meant he'd discovered something that contradicted the story we'd been told. I spent the next hour pacing around my kitchen, trying to prepare myself for whatever revelation was coming while avoiding going downstairs to face Marcus. I didn't trust my ability to hide my anxiety from him, and I didn't want to alert him that something was wrong before Rivera arrived. When the doorbell rang at 8 o'clock sharp, I let Rivera in through the front door and led him directly to the basement entrance. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He'd always reminded me of my father, solid and dependable, the kind of person you trusted instinctively. "This is going to be interesting," he said as we stood at the top of the basement stairs. "Detective Rivera is here," I called down as we descended. "He has information about the investigation." Marcus was sitting at the small dining table with a cup of coffee, and Katja was in the kitchen area cleaning up after breakfast. Sophia was in her designated play corner, working on what appeared to be a math worksheet. The scene looked so normal, so domestic, that it was hard to believe we were 20 feet underground discussing criminal threats and 20-year-old disappearances. Marcus stood when he saw Rivera, and I watched his face carefully for any sign of recognition or concern. What I saw looked like genuine nervousness mixed with hope, the expression of a man who was eager for news but afraid of what that news might be. "Mr. Murphy," Rivera said, extending his hand, "I have to say, this is not how I expected our first meeting to go." "Detective Rivera," Marcus replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for helping us with this situation." Rivera looked around the basement with obvious amazement. "This is quite a setup you have down here. How long did it take you to make it livable?" "A few years to get it really comfortable," Marcus said. "It started as just a place to hide temporarily, but when it became clear that the threat wasn't going away, we had to make it more permanent." "About that threat," Rivera said, settling into one of the chairs at the dining table, "I have some interesting news about Vincent Torino and his organization." Marcus sat back down, and I could see him bracing himself for whatever Rivera was about to tell us. "The good news is that Torino died 8 years ago, and his money laundering operation was shut down 5 years ago when most of the major players were arrested and convicted. So the original threat that drove you into hiding is definitely over." Marcus's face showed obvious relief. "So it's safe for us to stop hiding?" "Well, that's where things get complicated," Rivera said, and his tone shifted to something more serious. "Because someone has been actively looking for you for the past 15 years. Someone with considerable resources who has hired multiple private investigators and has access to law enforcement databases." I watched Marcus's face change as Rivera spoke. The relief disappeared, replaced by confusion and something that looked almost like fear. "Who?" Marcus asked. "That's what took me 3 days to figure out," Rivera said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "The inquiries were routed through several different agencies and shell companies, but I finally traced them back to their source." He opened the folder and placed a photograph on the table. It was a professional headshot of a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and expensive-looking clothes. She had intelligent eyes and the kind of confident expression that spoke of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "Do you recognize her?" Rivera asked. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long moment, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. "No," he said finally. "I've never seen her before in my life." Rivera studied Marcus's face with the sharp attention of someone trained to detect deception. "Are you sure about that?" "Because her name is Linda Torino Castellano, and she's Vincent Torino's daughter." The basement went completely silent. Even Sophia stopped working on her math worksheet and looked up at the adults with curious eyes. Marcus was staring at the photograph as if it might explode. "Vincent never mentioned having a daughter," Marcus said quietly. "Vincent had 3 children," Rivera continued. 2 sons who followed him into the family business and were arrested when the organization was taken down, and 1 daughter who went legitimate. Linda is a successful attorney who specializes in corporate law. She's also been obsessed with finding out what happened to the witness who disappeared 20 years ago. "But why?" Katja asked from the kitchen area. "If her father is dead and the organization is gone, why does it matter?" Rivera turned to look at her, and I could see him taking in the details of this underground family for the first time. "Because she believes that witness had information that could exonerate her brothers. According to my sources, Linda has always maintained that her father's organization was much smaller and less violent than the government claimed. She thinks the witness might have seen something that would prove her brothers were just low-level employees, not major players in the operation." Marcus was shaking his head slowly. "That's not what I saw. Vincent Torino was definitely running the operation, and his sons were heavily involved. I heard them discussing details about money transfers, about threats against people who weren't cooperating, about plans to expand into other territories." "Can you prove that?" Rivera asked. "I can testify to what I heard and saw, but I don't have any physical evidence. It's been 20 years, and I was only there for about an hour before Vincent realized I wasn't the person they were expecting. Rivera leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus with an expression that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Here's what I find interesting, Marcus. According to the FBI files I was able to access, the investigation into Vincent Torino's organization began about 6 months after you disappeared. Someone provided them with detailed information about the money laundering operation, including specific dates, amounts, and methods. Information that could only have come from someone with inside knowledge. Are you suggesting that I was the one who provided that information? Marcus asked. I'm suggesting that your story about being afraid to go to the authorities doesn't match the timeline of the federal investigation. Someone was definitely talking to the FBI, and that someone knew a lot more about Torino's operation than you could have learned in a single accidental encounter. I felt the foundation of everything I thought I understood shifting beneath me again. If Marcus had been in contact with federal authorities, if he'd been providing information that led to the eventual prosecution of the organization, then why had he stayed in hiding? Why had he let his family believe he was dead or missing? I never talked to the FBI, Marcus said, but his voice lacked the conviction I would have expected from someone telling the truth. Rivera opened his folder again and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. These are copies of FBI interview reports. The witness is identified only as, quote, Subject M. But the details of what he reported match exactly with what you've told me about your encounter with Vincent Torino. Marcus reached for the documents with shaking hands, scanning the pages quickly. As he read, his face grew paler, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the basement. I don't understand, he said finally. I never spoke to any federal agents. I never provided any information to law enforcement. Then how do you explain these reports? Rivera asked. How do you explain the fact that someone with your exact story was feeding information to the FBI for almost 2 years after your disappearance? Katya had moved closer to the table, and I could see the confusion and concern in her face. Sophia was still watching from her corner, obviously sensing the tension even if she didn't understand the details. Maybe there was another witness, Marcus suggested. Maybe someone else saw the same things I did. That's possible, Rivera acknowledged. But there's something else that bothers me about your story. According to these FBI files, Vincent Torino's organization never actually killed anyone. They used threats and intimidation, they moved a lot of money illegally, but there's no evidence that they ever followed through on their threats of violence. So when Vincent showed you those photographs of dead people, he was either lying to you or showing you pictures of victims from a completely different organization. The basement felt like it was spinning around me. Everything Marcus had told us about his reasons for disappearing was falling apart under Rivera's methodical investigation. If Vincent Torino's threats had been empty bluffs, if the organization wasn't actually violent, then Marcus's decision to fake his death and abandon his family seemed less like noble sacrifice and more like cowardice or something worse. There has to be an explanation, Marcus said, but his voice was weak and uncertain. Maybe the FBI files are incomplete. Maybe there were murders that were never connected to the organization. Rivera was watching Marcus with the steady gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. Marcus, I need to ask you directly. Is there anything about your disappearance that you haven't told us? Any other reason why you might have wanted to vanish 20 years ago? No, Marcus said quickly. Everything I told you is the truth. But I could see in Rivera's expression that he didn't believe him, and for the first time since discovering Marcus in my basement, I found myself wondering if I believed him either. Here's what I think happened, Rivera said, leaning forward on his elbows. I think you did encounter Vincent Torino's organization that day, and I think you were scared by what you saw. But instead of running away and hiding, I think you contacted the FBI and became an informant. I think you provided them with information for almost 2 years while living under an assumed identity, probably in witness protection. That's not true, Marcus protested. I think something went wrong with the arrangement. Maybe you were discovered, maybe you got scared, maybe you just decided you didn't want to cooperate anymore. So you disappeared again, this time from the FBI as well as from your family. Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. The liquid spread across the table, soaking into the FBI documents. You don't know what you're talking about. I never worked with the FBI. I never betrayed Vincent Torino or anyone else. Then explain Linda Castellano's search for you, Rivera said calmly. Explain why she spent 15 years and thousands of dollars trying to find a witness who should have been irrelevant to her once her father died. I don't know why she's looking for me. I think you do. I think she's looking for you because you have information that could help her brothers, and she believes you've been hiding that information for 20 years. Katya had gone very pale, and she was holding onto the back of Marcus's chair for support. Marcus, she said quietly, is this true? Have you been lying to us? No, Marcus said, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. Everything I've told you is the truth. I stood up then, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Get out, I said. Everyone turned to look at me, and I realized I'd spoken louder than I'd intended. What? Marcus asked. Get out of my house, all of you. I need time to think, and I can't do it with you here. Gerry, please, Marcus started, but I cut him off. 20 years, Marcus. 20 years I've been wondering what happened to you, and now I find out that not only are you alive, but you've probably been lying to me about everything since the moment I found you down here. That's not true. Then prove it. Answer Detective Rivera's questions. Explain why Linda Castellano has been looking for you. Explain how someone with your exact story was feeding information to the FBI. Explain why you chose to disappear from witness protection instead of trusting the system to keep your family safe. Marcus looked around the basement wildly, as if searching for some escape route that didn't exist. I can't, he said finally. You can't or you won't. I can't explain because I don't remember. The basement went silent again, and this time the silence stretched so long that I could hear the house settling above us. What do you mean you don't remember? Rivera asked. Marcus sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. There are gaps in my memory from that time. Big gaps. I remember the encounter with Vincent Torino, and I remember being terrified and running away. But the next clear memory I have is being in a motel room in Springfield about 18 months later, with no memory of how I got there or what I'd been doing. You're saying you have amnesia? I asked incredulously. I'm saying there's a period of almost 2 years that I can't account for. I've always assumed I was just hiding, moving from place to place, staying off the grid. But maybe I was doing other things. Maybe I was working with the FBI. I honestly don't know. Rivera was taking notes again, his expression thoughtful. Amnesia can be caused by trauma, but it's unusual for it to affect such a specific time period while leaving earlier and later memories intact. Unless it wasn't trauma-induced, I said slowly, a horrible possibility occurring to me. Unless someone wanted you to forget what happened during those 2 years. Marcus looked at me with growing alarm. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe you weren't just an informant, maybe you were something more. Maybe you were undercover, or in witness protection, or involved in some kind of operation that required your memories to be suppressed afterward. Rivera was nodding slowly. That would explain the memory gaps. And it would explain why Linda Castellano is so desperate to find you. If you were involved in a deeper operation against her father's organization, you might have information that goes beyond what's in the official FBI files. But why would they suppress my memories? Marcus asked. Why not just let me go back to my family once the operation was over? Maybe because the operation isn't over, Rivera said grimly. Maybe because Vincent Torino's organization was just one small part of something bigger, and your safety still depends on people believing you're dead. Katya was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of a woman watching her entire world crumble around her. Sophia had abandoned her math worksheet and was standing uncertainly in the middle of the room, obviously frightened by the adult emotions she couldn't understand. I need all of you to leave, I said again, more gently this time. Not permanently, just for today. I need time to process this, and I need to make some phone calls without anyone listening. Where are we supposed to go? Katya asked. We've been living underground for 8 years. We don't have anywhere else. I looked at this woman who had chosen to share my husband's exile, who had raised a child in a basement and was preparing to give birth to another one in the same impossible circumstances. Whatever Marcus had done or failed to do, Katya and Sophia were innocent victims of his choices. "There's a motel about 10 miles from here," I said. "The Riverside Inn. Check in under the name Collins and pay cash. I'll call you there when I'm ready to talk again." Rivera stood up and gathered his papers. "Gerry, I need to make some more calls, dig deeper into this witness protection angle. But I want you to be very careful. If Marcus was involved in something bigger than we thought, and if people are still looking for him, then you could be in danger too." "What kind of danger?" "The kind that doesn't care about collateral damage." After they left, I sat alone in the basement for the first time since discovering it 3 days earlier. The space felt different without the family that had brought it to life, more like the tomb I'd imagined it to be for 20 years. I walked around slowly, examining the photographs on the walls, the children's drawings, the evidence of a life lived in secret. In one corner, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small metal box hidden behind a stack of books, secured with a combination lock. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what secrets it might contain, wondering if I really wanted to know any more truths about the man I'd married and lost and found again. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and I realized that I still hadn't told my daughter that her father was alive. With everything that had been happening, with all the questions and revelations and complications, I'd put off the most important conversation of all. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, trying to keep my voice normal. "Mom, are you okay? You sound strange." I looked around the basement where my husband had been living with another woman and their child, where federal investigators had apparently convinced him to forget 2 years of his life, where nothing was what it seemed, and every answer led to more questions. "Elena," I said, "I need to tell you something about your father." "What about Dad?" I took a deep breath and prepared to change my daughter's life forever. "He's alive, Elena. Your father is alive, and he's been living in our basement for the past several years." The silence that followed was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Elena spoke, and her voice was barely a whisper. "What did you just say?" "Your father didn't die or disappear, Elena. He's been hiding, and I just found him 3 days ago. There's a lot more to explain, but I needed you to know the basic truth first." "I'm getting on a plane," Elena said, and I could hear her moving around, probably already starting to pack. "I'm coming home right now." "Elena, wait, there are complications. There are things we need to figure out before." "I don't care about complications, Mom. If my father is alive, if he's been alive all this time, then I'm coming home to see him." After she hung up, I continued sitting in the empty basement, surrounded by the evidence of an impossible life and waiting for my daughter to arrive home to a truth that was going to break her heart in ways she couldn't imagine. Because how do you tell your child that their father chose to let them grow up fatherless? How do you explain that love sometimes looks like abandonment, that protection can be indistinguishable from betrayal? And how do you prepare them for the possibility that even that painful truth might not be the whole story? Elena arrived at my doorstep 18 hours later, looking exactly like she had as a teenager when she was angry and trying not to show it. Her jaw was set in that stubborn line I remembered from countless arguments about curfew and homework, and her eyes had the same determined gleam that had gotten her through nursing school and her father's disappearance, and every other challenge life had thrown at her. "Where is he?" she asked without even saying hello. I looked at my daughter, this strong, beautiful woman who had built a life for herself despite growing up with an enormous question mark where her father should have been, and I realized that nothing I could say would adequately prepare her for what she was about to learn. "They're at a motel," I said. "There are things you need to understand before you see him." "They?" I stepped aside to let her into the house, noting the plural she'd caught and dreading the conversation that was about to unfold. "Elena, your father isn't alone. There is a woman named Katya and a little girl named Sophia. And Katya is pregnant." Elena stopped in the middle of my living room and turned to face me with an expression of pure disbelief. "Are you telling me that my father has another family?" "It's complicated." "It's really not, Mom. Either he has another family or he doesn't." I gestured toward the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat for 20 years eating meals alone, wondering what had happened to the man I'd married. Sit down, please. Let me explain everything before you make any decisions about what you want to do. For the next hour, I told Elena everything. About the sounds I'd been hearing, about discovering the basement, about Marcus's story regarding Vincent Torino and the threats against our family. I told her about Detective Rivera's investigation, about the gaps in Marcus's memory, about the possibility that he'd been involved in something much bigger and more complex than he remembered. Elena listened without interrupting, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, hurt, and confusion. When I finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, staring at her hands folded on the table. "So let me make sure I understand this," she said finally. "Dad disappeared because some criminal threatened to kill us if he talked to the police. But instead of trusting us with that information, he decided to fake his death and let us spend 20 years grieving him. Then, while we were grieving, he started a new family and had another daughter. And now we find out that he might have been working with the FBI the whole time, and just forgot about it. That's the situation, yes. And you believe him?" I had been dreading that question because I still didn't know how to answer it. Did I believe Marcus? Parts of his story made sense, and the fear I'd seen in his eyes had seemed genuine. But the inconsistencies that Rivera had pointed out were troubling, and the memory gaps felt too convenient. "I believe that he's telling me what he remembers," I said carefully. "But I don't think we have the whole truth yet." Elena stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the backyard, the same window where she'd watched for her father's return as a little girl. "I need to see him," she said. "I need to look him in the eye and hear his explanation directly. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I've been ready for 20 years, Mom. I used to dream about the day he'd come home and explain where he'd been. I imagined every possible scenario except this one." I called the motel and asked to be connected to the Collins room. Marcus answered on the second ring, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "Gerry? Is everything all right?" "Elena is here. She wants to see you." There was a long pause. "Now?" "Now. Should we come back to the house, or do you want to meet somewhere else?" I looked at Elena, who was still standing at the window with her back to me. "Come back to the house. But Marcus, I want you to be prepared. She's angry, and she has every right to be." "I know. I'll be ready." 30 minutes later, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Elena was sitting at the kitchen table now, her hands folded in front of her, looking like she was preparing for battle. I went to the front door and watched as Marcus helped Katya out of an old sedan that I didn't recognize. Sophia scrambled out of the back seat, looking around at the neighborhood with wide eyes, probably seeing more of the outside world in that moment than she ever had before. Marcus looked older than he had just the day before, more worn down, as if the weight of maintaining his secrets for 20 years was finally beginning to crush him. Katya was pale and moved carefully, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Sophia stayed close to her side, obviously sensing that something important and potentially dangerous was happening. I opened the door before they could knock, and Marcus looked at me with an expression that was part hope and part terror. "She's in the kitchen," I said quietly. Marcus nodded and stepped inside, followed by Katya and Sophia. The little girl was staring around my house with fascination, taking in the normal domestic details of a life lived above ground. It occurred to me that this was probably the first real house she'd ever been in. We all walked toward the kitchen together, a strange procession of people connected by impossible circumstances. When we reached the doorway, Elena looked up from the table, and I watched her face as she saw her father for the first time in 20 years. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. They just stared at each other across the kitchen, this father and daughter who had been separated by choices and circumstances that neither of them had fully controlled. Marcus looked exactly like an older version of the man who had kissed Elena goodbye when she was 8 years old. Elena looked nothing like the little girl he had left behind. "Hello, Elena," Marcus said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Dad." The word came out as barely a whisper. Then Elena stood up and crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps, and I thought she was going to hug him. Instead, she stopped just out of arm's reach and studied his face with the critical eye of someone looking for truth. You look good for a dead man, she said. Marcus flinched at the words, but he didn't look away from her gaze. I know how this must seem to you. Do you? Do you really? Because I don't think you have any idea what it's been like to grow up wondering if your father left because he didn't love you enough to stay. Elena, that's not. Or wondering if he was lying dead in a ditch somewhere, or if he'd been kidnapped and murdered, or if he'd just decided that his family wasn't worth the trouble of staying. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Elena held up her hand to stop him. I used to make up stories about where you were, she continued. I told myself that you were a secret agent on an important mission, or that you'd been captured by enemies and were fighting to get back to us. I told myself that wherever you were, whatever had happened to you, you were thinking about Mom and me every single day and trying to find a way home. Tears were running down Marcus's face now, but Elena's voice remained steady and controlled. But you weren't trying to find a way home, were you? You were building a new home with a new family. You were playing father to another little girl while your actual daughter was going to therapy and learning to cope with abandonment issues. Marcus looked at Sophia, who was pressed against Katya's side and watching this confrontation with frightened eyes. It wasn't like that, he said quietly. Then what was it like? Explain it to me, Dad. Make me understand how a father chooses to let his child grow up thinking he's dead. Marcus looked around the kitchen, at all of us watching him, waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of 20 years of secrets and lies and impossible choices. I was trying to protect you, he said, falling back on the same explanation he'd given me. From what? From criminals who might have threatened us? Or from the truth about what kind of man you really are? The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Sophia's quiet whimpering. The little girl was obviously frightened by the angry voices and the tension between the adults, and I found myself wanting to comfort her even as I struggled with my own complicated feelings about her existence. Katya spoke for the first time since they'd arrived. Perhaps Sophia and I should wait outside, she said quietly. No, Elena said, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Stay. She should hear this, too. She should know what kind of man her father is. Elena, I said, recognizing the cruelty in her words even as I understood the pain that was driving them. What, Mom? Should I pretend this is normal? Should I welcome my father's mistress and his illegitimate daughter with open arms? Should I act like this is some kind of happy family reunion? They're not responsible for his choices, I said gently. No, but they're certainly benefiting from them. She gets to have a father who reads her bedtime stories and helps her with her homework. She gets to have the father that I lost when I was 8 years old. Sophia was crying openly now, and Katya was trying to comfort her while fighting back her own tears. Marcus looked like he was in physical pain, and I realized that Elena was systematically destroying everyone in the room with surgical precision. Elena, stop, I said more firmly. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but taking it out on a 7-year-old child isn't going to change anything. Elena looked at me with surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was there. Then she looked at Sophia, really looked at her, and I could see some of the anger drain from her face. You're right, she said quietly. I'm sorry, you didn't ask for any of this. She walked over to where Sophia was standing and knelt down so they were at eye level. Hi, Sophia. I'm Elena. I'm Marcus's other daughter. Sophia looked at Elena with curiosity and caution. Are you angry at Papa? Yes, I am. But not at you. You didn't do anything wrong. Did Papa do something wrong? Elena glanced up at Marcus, then back at Sophia. That's complicated. Adults sometimes make choices that hurt other people, even when they think they're doing the right thing. Like when Mama and Papa had to leave our home because it wasn't safe? Something like that. I watched this exchange between my daughter and Marcus's daughter, these two girls who were connected by a man who had failed them both in different ways, and I realized that we were all going to have to find a way to move forward together. There was no going back to the way things were before, no simple resolution that would satisfy everyone's sense of justice or fairness. I want to talk to you alone, Elena said to Marcus. Just the two of us. Marcus nodded. All right. Not here. Somewhere else. Somewhere we can be completely honest with each other. I suggested the garden, and Elena and Marcus went outside while Katya, Sophia, and I remained in the kitchen. Through the window, I could see them walking slowly around the perimeter of the yard, Elena talking animatedly while Marcus listened with his head down. She hates me, Katya said quietly. She doesn't hate you. She's hurt and angry, and she's looking for someone to blame. That's normal. What's going to happen to us? Sophia asked. Are we going to have to leave Papa? I looked at this little girl who had asked the most important question of all, and I realized that I didn't have an answer. What was going to happen to any of us? How do you rebuild a family when the foundation was built on lies? How do you create trust when the person at the center of everything had proven himself fundamentally untrustworthy? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Rivera's name appeared on the screen. I have news, he said without preamble. I found out who's been looking for Marcus and why. What did you learn? Linda Castellano hasn't been trying to find Marcus to help her brothers. She's been trying to find him because she believes he murdered her father. I felt my legs go weak. What? Vincent Torino's death wasn't natural. The heart attack was induced by a drug that's nearly impossible to detect unless you know to look for it. Linda has been investigating her father's death privately for 8 years, and she's convinced that the mysterious witness who disappeared 20 years ago came back to get revenge. I looked out the window at Marcus and Elena, still deep in conversation in my garden. Are you saying that Marcus killed Vincent Torino? I'm saying that's what Linda Castellano believes. And if she's right, if Marcus was involved in Vincent's death, then his memory loss might not be accidental. It might be something he's deliberately maintaining to avoid prosecution for murder. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the kitchen floor. Katya and Sophia both looked at me with alarm, but I couldn't find my voice to explain what I'd just heard. Instead, I stared out at the garden where my daughter was finally having the conversation with her father that she'd been waiting 20 years to have, not knowing that she might be talking to a murderer. Through the window, I could see Elena and Marcus sitting on the old wooden bench that Thomas had built when we first moved into the house. They were facing each other now, and Elena was holding both of Marcus's hands in hers. Whatever he was telling her, whatever explanation he was finally giving her, it seemed to be having an impact. Her posture had softened, and she was leaning toward him instead of pulling away. But how much of what he was telling her was true? How much of what any of us had been told was true? If Marcus was capable of murder, if he'd killed Vincent Torino in cold blood and then spent 8 years pretending not to remember anything about that period of his life, then what did that say about everything else he'd told us? I picked up the phone from the floor and put it back to my ear. Rivera was still talking. Gerry, are you there? I'm here. I need to talk to Marcus again. Tonight. And this time, I need him to answer some very specific questions about Vincent Torino's death. I watched Elena stand up from the bench and hug her father. A long, tight embrace that spoke of forgiveness, or at least the beginning of understanding. They were walking back toward the house now, both of them looking more relaxed than they had since Elena's arrival. He's coming back inside, I said to Rivera. How do you want to handle this? Carefully. If Marcus is a murderer, if he's been successfully hiding that fact for 8 years, then he's not going to confess easily. And if he feels cornered, he might decide that the safest course of action is to disappear again. What about Katya and Sophia? What about Elena? If Marcus runs, he'll probably try to take Katya and Sophia with him. They're the only family he has left, and he's already invested 8 years in building a life with them. Elena and Marcus came through the back door, both of them looking like they'd reached some kind of understanding. Elena's eyes were red from crying, but her expression was calmer than it had been since she'd arrived. We talked, she said simply. We have a lot more talking to do, but it's a start. Marcus looked at Katya with obvious relief. Elena understands why I made the choices I made. She doesn't like them, but she understands. I wanted to warn them about Rivera's phone call, about the new information that cast everything in a different light, but I didn't know how to do it without destroying the fragile peace they'd just established. Detective Rivera called, I said finally. He wants to talk to you again, Marcus. Tonight. Marcus's face immediately grew wary. What about? He has new information about Linda Castellano and why she's been looking for you. What kind of information? I looked at Elena, at Katya and Sophia, at all the people who would be affected by whatever truth was about to be revealed, and I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrible. He thinks she believes you killed her father. The kitchen erupted in shocked voices. Elena demanding explanations, Katya crying out in her native language, Sophia asking what was happening. But Marcus went completely silent, his face draining of all color as he stared at me. That's impossible, he said finally. Vincent Torino died of a heart attack. I was hiding in motels when he died. I never saw him again after that day in the warehouse. Then you'll be able to prove that to Detective Rivera when he gets here. When he gets here? He's on his way. He should be here within the hour. Marcus looked around the kitchen at all of us, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options and consequences. For a moment, I thought he was going to run. I could see him considering it, mapping out escape routes and evaluating his chances of disappearing again. But then he looked at Sophia, this little girl who had never known any life except the one she'd shared with him underground, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. I won't run, he said quietly. Whatever happens, I won't put any of you through that again. Elena moved to stand beside him, and I was surprised to see her take his arm in a gesture of support. We'll face this together, she said, all of us. But even as she spoke those words, I could see the doubt creeping back into her eyes. Because if Marcus had killed Vincent Torino, if he'd committed murder and hidden that fact from everyone who loved him, then everything else he'd told us was potentially a lie. His reasons for disappearing, his fears about our safety, his love for his family, his regret about the choices he'd made, all of it could be an elaborate fiction designed to hide the fact that he was a killer. Rivera arrived exactly 1 hour later, and this time, he wasn't alone. He brought with him a federal agent named Sarah Chen and a stack of files that looked thick enough to contain 20 years' worth of secrets. We all gathered in my living room, an unlikely assembly of people connected by impossible circumstances. Marcus sat on the couch with Katya beside him, her hand resting on her belly and her face pale with worry. Elena had chosen a chair where she could watch both her father and the investigators, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the man she'd just forgiven with the possibility that he was a murderer. Sophia sat on the floor with a coloring book, apparently oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Mr. Murphy, Agent Chen began, we need to ask you some questions about Vincent Torino's death 8 years ago. I told Detective Rivera I was in hiding when Vincent died. I had nothing to do with his death. Where exactly were you hiding? Marcus paused, and I could see him searching his memory for details that might not exist. I'm not sure. I was moving around a lot during that period. Motels, shelters, sometimes sleeping rough. Do you have any documentation from that time? Receipts, registration records, anything that could verify your whereabouts? I was paying cash for everything and using fake names. I didn't want to leave a paper trail. Agent Chen opened one of her files and pulled out a photograph. Do you recognize this man? It was a picture of a thin, nervous-looking man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Marcus studied it for a long moment, then shook his head. I don't think so. Should I? His name was David Kowalski. He was a chemist who worked for a pharmaceutical company, and he was Vincent Torino's neighbor. 3 days before Vincent died, someone matching your description visited Mr. Kowalski and asked detailed questions about cardiac medications and how they could be used to simulate a heart attack. The room went completely silent. Even Sophia looked up from her coloring book, sensing the change in atmosphere. That wasn't me, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Kowalski picked your photo out of a lineup 6 months ago, Agent Chen continued. He was very certain of his identification. That's impossible. I never talked to anyone about cardiac medications. Rivera leaned forward in his chair. Marcus, we know that you were in contact with the FBI during the period when your memory is unclear. We have records of payments made to informants, and the amounts and dates match with someone of your profile. But I don't remember any of that. Memory can be a funny thing, Agent Chen said. Sometimes people forget things that are too painful or too dangerous to remember. And sometimes people claim to forget things when remembering them would be inconvenient. Marcus stood up abruptly, causing everyone in the room to tense. Are you accusing me of murder? We're asking you to account for your whereabouts during a period when you claim to have no memory, and to explain why a witness places you at the scene asking questions about the exact method used to kill Vincent Torino. Elena was staring at her father with growing horror, and I could see her beginning to doubt everything they'd discussed in the garden. Katya was crying silently, one hand covering her mouth to muffle the sound. I want a lawyer, Marcus said. That's your right, Agent Chen replied. But before you make that call, I want you to consider something. Linda Castellano has been building a case against you for 8 years. She has evidence, witnesses, and the resources to pursue this for as long as it takes. Your only chance of avoiding prosecution is to cooperate with us and help us understand what really happened during those missing years. Marcus looked around the room at all of us, at the family he'd built on secrets and the family he'd abandoned for secrets, and I could see him struggling with a decision that would determine the rest of his life. What kind of cooperation? He asked finally. The truth, all of it. About Vincent Torino, about your work with the FBI, about why you really disappeared, and why you've been hiding for 20 years. Marcus sank back down onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears and something that looked like relief. I remember, he said quietly. I remember everything. Agent Chen and Rivera exchanged glances, and I could see them preparing for a confession that would change everything. Vincent Torino didn't just threaten my family, Marcus began. He killed someone that day. Right in front of me. A man who had been skimming money from the organization. Someone Vincent wanted to make an example of. I didn't just witness money laundering. I witnessed a murder. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. When I went to the FBI, they didn't just want information about the money laundering. They wanted me to help them build a case for murder. But Vincent was careful, and the victim's body was never found. The only evidence was my testimony, and that wasn't enough to convict him. So what did you do? Rivera asked. I agreed to go undercover, to get close to Vincent's organization and gather evidence that could be used in court. The FBI created a new identity for me, taught me how to infiltrate the organization without being detected. And during that time, you had access to Vincent directly. Marcus nodded. I worked for him for almost 2 years. I gained his trust, learned about his operations, documented everything. But I also learned about other murders, other people he'd killed who would never get justice unless someone stopped him. So you stopped him. I made a choice. Vincent was going to kill again. He was planning to murder a federal judge who was refusing to cooperate with the organization. I couldn't let that happen. Agent Chen was taking notes rapidly. How did you do it? I used information I'd learned from David Kowalski about cardiac medications. I introduced a drug into Vincent's system that would cause a heart attack that looked natural. Then I disappeared from the undercover operation and went back into hiding. Why didn't you contact your family after Vincent was dead? Marcus looked at Elena with profound sadness. Because I'd become a killer. Because even though Vincent deserved to die, even though I prevented him from killing innocent people, I'd still committed murder. How do you go home to your wife and daughter after something like that? How do you pretend to be a normal husband and father when you've taken a life? Elena was staring at her father with an expression I couldn't read. Horror, certainly, but also something that might have been understanding. So you let us think you were dead rather than tell us the truth. I thought it would be easier for you to grieve a dead hero than to love a living killer. The room fell silent again, and I realized that we'd finally arrived at the complete truth. Marcus hadn't just disappeared to protect us from Vincent Torino's threats. He'd disappeared because he'd become someone he couldn't live with, someone he thought we couldn't love. What happens now? Katya asked, speaking for the first time since the investigators had arrived. Agent Chen closed her files and looked around the room. That depends on a lot of factors. The statute of limitations, the circumstances of the crime, the cooperation Mr. Murphy is willing to provide in closing other cases. Are you arresting him? Not today. But Mr. Murphy will need to come with us for further questioning, and he'll need to remain available for the duration of the investigation. Marcus stood up and walked over to where Sophia was still coloring on the floor. He knelt down beside her and spoke quietly in her ear. She nodded and gave him a hug that lasted longer than usual. Then he walked over to Elena and took her hands in his. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything. For leaving you, for lying to you, for being the kind of man who could do what I did." Elena looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I don't forgive you for leaving," she said. "But I understand why you thought you had to." As Marcus prepared to leave with the investigators, I found myself thinking about the past 20 years and how they might have been different if he'd trusted us with the truth from the beginning. If he'd told me about witnessing a murder, about working undercover with the FBI, about his decision to kill Vincent Torino to prevent other deaths, would I have been able to love a man who'd committed murder for what he believed were the right reasons? Would Elena have been able to understand that sometimes good people do terrible things to protect others? I'll never know the answers to those questions, because Marcus made the choice for all of us. He decided that we were better off without him than with the truth about who he'd become. And in making that decision, he'd condemned all of us to 20 years of questions and pain and incomplete lives. But as I watched him walk out my front door, possibly for the last time, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad for the man who'd been so consumed by guilt and shame that he'd chosen exile over honesty. I was sad for the little girl who'd grown up without a father, because he thought she was better off without him. I was sad for the family he'd built underground, who might now lose the only father they'd ever known. Most of all, I was sad for all the wasted years, all the love that had been hoarded instead of shared, all the chances for healing and forgiveness that had been lost because one man decided he was too broken to be loved. But I wasn't without hope. Elena had begun the process of forgiving her father, and that was something. Katya and Sophia would need support and help navigating their new reality, and I could provide that. The new baby would be born into a world where truth was possible, even when that truth was painful. As for Marcus, his fate would be determined by courts and lawyers and legal proceedings that were beyond any of our control. But whatever happened to him, we would all have to figure out how to move forward with the knowledge of who he really was and what he'd done. And maybe, finally, that would be enough. Maybe the truth, however complicated and painful, would be enough to build something real and lasting. Something that honored both the good and the terrible in all of us. Something that could survive the weight of complete honesty. Elena stayed for another week, helping me figure out how to support Katya and Sophia, while Marcus went through the legal process of confessing to a 20-year-old murder. We established routines that felt almost normal, considering the circumstances. Sophia started attending the local elementary school, experiencing classrooms and playgrounds and friendships for the first time in her life. Katya began preparing for the birth of her second child, this time with access to proper medical care and the support of people who cared about her well-being. I converted the basement back into a regular basement, moving Katya and Sophia into the upstairs bedrooms that had been empty for too long. The house felt full again, alive with the sounds of family, even if that family didn't look anything like what I'd expected when I'd first bought the place with Marcus 30 years ago. 6 months later, Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for voluntary manslaughter, with credit for time served and the possibility of parole in 3 years. The judge took into account his cooperation with ongoing investigations, his genuine remorse, and the circumstances that had led to his crime. Elena attended the sentencing hearing, and afterward she told me that she'd finally been able to look at her father and see both the man who'd left her and the man who'd made an impossible choice to save other lives. Katya gave birth to a son, Daniel, just as the leaves were turning colors in the fall. Marcus was allowed to see his new son through video calls from prison, and though it wasn't the family reunion any of us had imagined, it was a beginning. Sophia started calling me Grandma Gerry, and Elena began planning regular visits to help with the children and to continue building a relationship with her half-siblings. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and remember the sound of children's laughter drifting up through my floorboards, and I think about how that impossible sound led to all of this. A lost husband found, a broken family slowly healing, a truth that was more complicated than any of us could have imagined. It wasn't the ending I'd dreamed of during all those years of wondering and waiting, But it was real, and it was honest, and it was ours. And sometimes, that's enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.